Okay, so today I want to talk with you guys about an argument from cause and effect. This is sometimes called the cosmological argument. Now, the cosmological argument is a type of argument. It's an argument kind that's based on seeking causes or explanations of things. I'm going to unpack this argument step by step. So this argument is designed to help us investigate this question. Can reason lead to God? What do I mean by reason? I'm using this term in a broad way to include anything that you can see to be true or you can investigate just using your mind, okay? And it's a universal power, so anybody with a mind can use this power to investigate things. You can investigate whether 2 plus 2 equals 6 or 4. You can investigate whether if A is true, then A is not true. I mean, what do you think about that? If A is true, then A is not true. That doesn't seem true. How do you know that? How do you actually know? How do you know that A is A? How do you know A is not A? Okay? These may seem like silly questions, but I think part of the reason for that is because you can just see in your mind some things pretty clearly. Now, not everything's equally clear, but we're going to see what we can see using the light of reason. So the question is, can reason lead to God? So before we go into the argument, the cosmological argument, we want to start by defining our terms. And this word God is, well, it's open to interpretation. People have different meanings in mind. Something I've kind of wondered about or thought about is whether people across different cultures, they will sort of pick up on a certain aspect of God in their culture, or they'll emphasize a certain aspect of God in their culture, and different cultures will emphasize different things, and so it'll create this appearance that everybody just kind of has their own God, and that there's no core concept of God that people are thinking about. Or it's almost like if there's a core concept of God and God has many different attributes, then many different people could be aware of the different attributes. Like some people might think of God as the creator or the source of things. Other people might think of God more in terms of being a great person or a standard of moral accountability. Or for others, it could be God as their provider. And so people, different cultures could emphasize different properties. But anyway, really what I want to do is see if we can unpack a core concept of God so we can orient our investigation. So, are you guys aware of the God of the philosophers? So I sometimes call this the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Anselm. Anselm was a philosopher, and he made famous this concept of God as the greatest conceivable being. So to think about this, think about different beings in your mind. So you can imagine a being that is very smart, but then you can imagine another being that's even smarter. And if you take intelligence out to its logical limit, if there is a logical limit, you could think of a being that has supreme cognitive power or a supreme mind. Okay, but if it has a supreme mind, but is not very powerful, then it wouldn't be as great as a being that has supreme power and a supreme mind. So the God of the philosophers is the God that is the greatest that one can even think of. Now, from this basic concept, we can deduce some other interesting attributes, or at least according to the philosophical argument here, the argument is that if there were a being that is the greatest conceivable, I'm not assuming here for sake of argument that there is, but if there were, this being would have certain attributes. We talked about its intelligence. It wouldn't just be, ignorant of lots of things. It wouldn't be very weak. Instead, it would have the following, I call these fundamental attributes. It would have supreme power. Because if it had less than supreme power, then there could be a greater being. You could think of a greater being, a being with even more power. It would have supreme knowledge. It would have supreme goodness. Now, why power, knowledge, and goodness? Why those things? Well, the thought is that those things are great features to have. Or sometimes people put it this way: these are great making features. The being that has these features is greater by having these features than it would be if it didn't have these features. So knowledge, power, and goodness, they all have something in common. Here's a way of sort of drawing out your intuition. I call this the praise test. Let's imagine that you're praising somebody. So I'm going to imagine I'm praising my wife, Rachel. So I tell her, "You're so great. You're awesome. I'm so glad you married me. I'm so lucky." I begin to list her attributes. I say, Rachel, you are just so powerful. You're so strong, and you bring security to your children and to me. You're just so powerful, and you're so knowledgeable. You know so many things. Rachel, I just love you so much. You're so mean. You're so evil. You just don't know how to do anything good. Okay, now I don't say that last thing because if I did, that would be sort of inconsistent with the other two. It would be inconsistent with praising her, is what I'm trying to say. Or think about it the other way. Let's say that I tell her that she's really good, she's very virtuous, she's very powerful, but she just doesn't know very much. If you ever tell somebody I know more than you do, it's not exactly a way of praising them, right? Praising them, when you're praising somebody, what you're doing is you're pointing out their greatness. You're drawing attention to their greatness. And sometimes people will wonder, well, is this just subjective? Is this just, the concept of greatness here is just an opinion? And I wonder actually where that comes from. We've talked in this class about facts and opinions. And we've talked about not being a sheep that follows other sheep. And we've talked about how sometimes people will pick up beliefs based from their culture. We learn in school that statements about greatness are all opinions. Statements about science and numbers and, the shape of the earth, those are all facts. But those very classifications are just stated. They're just given to us by authority. Is it true? Is it a fact that statements about greatness are just opinions? You might think so. That belief might be sort of baked into you. But here I actually want to make a distinction between subjective greatness and a kind of greatness that is about reality. So subjective greatness could just reflect your own preference. So maybe you prefer one kind of ice cream. That ice cream is great for you, but not for somebody else. But there could be another notion of greatness that has to do with actual reality. And to illustrate this, imagine that there's a person, call her Sue, and imagine that Sue doesn't know. Well, she doesn't know. She doesn't have friends. She doesn't even know that she's valuable. She hasn't really thought about that. And imagine Sue is all alone, and a gang come up. They come to Sue, and they want to destroy her. And the gang prefers that she be gone. Well, in the preference understanding of greatness, Sue is not great for anybody. She's not great to anybody. And so she can just be destroyed because there's nothing that's great. There's nothing of value there. You can think of greatness here, and I'm thinking of value. And there's nothing of value there, so they destroy her. Well, you might think that, okay, in addition to subjective greatness, there's this sort of intrinsic or objective greatness that Sue has. Even if she doesn't know she has it, she actually has this great value. And so that's why she shouldn't be destroyed. Even if she doesn't know that she has greatness, and even if this gang doesn't know it, she has it in virtue of the kind of being she is. She is a being capable of power, knowledge. She has power. She's capable of knowledge and moral decisions. And those things contribute to her intrinsic greatness, her value. So what I'm doing here is I'm just drawing attention to this distinction because I think sometimes people will say, well, all of this is just subjective, and I want to challenge that for you. Now, the only way that you can really see that there are great properties is through this power that you have within you. This is why one of the things in this class that I've emphasized is your many different powers. You've got many different powers to see things. And there are many things you won't see if you're not using all your powers. If you're only using your powers to see shapes, okay, you're not going to see your power to see greatness, to see what would make a being worthy to be worshipped, let's say, or which properties are praiseworthy properties. So I want to suggest to you that if there were a being that is the greatest that could be conceived, then that being would thereby have supreme power, supreme knowledge, and supreme goodness. And there's one more attribute. Can you guys guess what it is? Can you think of a being that has supreme knowledge, power, and goodness, but it's not the greatest conceivable being? Existence. Supreme existence, I call it. And I'll say more about this, but supreme existence, you could think of this as necessary existence. What that means is this being cannot not exist. You can't destroy the being. So to help motivate this, imagine you've got some technology that's got a lot of power, it's got a lot of knowledge, it's got a lot of goodness, but it falls apart really easily. Then you've got the same powers of a technology. It's got the same powers, knowledge, goodness, but it's waterproof. Doesn't fall apart very easily. Which thing will you pay more money for? You might think that you're going to pay more money for something that has supreme power, knowledge, goodness, and it can't fall apart very easily. It's got supreme existence. And so the greatest conceivable being is going to have power, knowledge, and goodness and existence to the greatest conceivable degree, or in the greatest conceivable way. So I want to really emphasize for you guys, this may feel almost familiar, this concept. It may seem maybe unimportant in a certain way because it seems so familiar. But what this concept does, what makes it so significant, so powerful, is that it unifies these different properties and explains how they all come from this one basic root of greatness. It's the greatness that is the root of these attributes of God. This is why God has all these other attributes. It's not just this arbitrary list. I think sometimes people think of God as sort of arbitrary, like a flying spaghetti monster, or a just random set of things that human beings made up because they're afraid of the unknown or whatever. It's just a random, arbitrary reflection of your own culture. But the philosopher's concept of God is not an arbitrary list. Instead, it unifies the basic concept of God in terms of this core concept of greatness, sometimes called worship worthiness, the being than which none greater could even be thought. So that's the concept. Now, so far I haven't made any arguments for why you might think this being is real, but I want you to see this classical conception of God. Okay, so let's continue. Is there any reason to think God is real? So there's this verse here from Paul's letter to the Romans. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. From effects, you might think. Now that phrase, has been clearly seen, my own view is that doesn't mean that everybody clearly sees it. I mean, like, do babies just clearly see God's eternal power and divine nature? But that some people have. That human beings, that this is something human beings have recognized. But is that true? Is that actually true? I mean, is there a way to actually see through reason, through reflection on the things that have been made, that there's something underlying those things, some sort of ultimate maker of the things that have been made? So you can think of the things that have been made, like your fingers, your eyebrows, I don't know, tables and chairs. Those are things that you can see. And then the things that you won't see will be the causes of those things, the things that made those things. Those things aren't within your vision right now. And yet you think that those things that you see do have causes, that there is something that makes them. And then The idea here is that God would be the ultimate cause, the ultimate maker of the things that are made. But is that true? Is there an ultimate maker? Is there a way to really know this? Well, there are different arguments. You can separate different arguments based on different kinds of effects that you might look at, different kinds of things that have been made. So there's arguments from design that are based on looking at certain things that look designed or certain kinds of complex functionality. There's arguments from consciousness based on looking at the fact that you have consciousness. There's arguments from reason based on the fact that you're able to reason rationally. Sometimes people say that what we want to do is be rational, and that's why we shouldn't believe in God. We want to be rational. Well, rationality is itself one of the things that we can see in our own minds. Rationality exists, but what's the ultimate explanation of rationality? Some people have argued that in order for there to be rationality, there needs to be some kind of rational source, rational foundation for rationality, some kind of rational foundation which itself exists necessarily and robustly. Okay, so what else has been made? Beautiful things have been made. There is a sense of right and wrong, a moral landscape. And so people make an argument for an ultimate moral foundation. Now, these different effects will be arguments for different features of God. So you might think that the argument from morality, from our moral observations, is an argument for a kind of ultimate moral standard built into God's nature. Or the argument from rationality being an argument for an ultimate mind or a rational foundation. Okay, so rationality is like one attribute, which is an attribute predicted by God's supreme mental capacities or supreme knowledge. But there are different attributes. So what we're going to do here is we're going to slow this down. I'm just giving a big picture and talking about different things you see as a way of inferring the nature of the cause. I want to slow this down, and we're going to look at one particular argument. I mentioned the cosmological argument carefully, step by step. So there's a little bit of history. Once upon a time, a reason for God was discovered. The reason here I'm referring to is this argument from cause and effect. This general argument from cause and effect. Aristotle added details to this reason. The reason was studied and developed further throughout the ages by various philosophers. You don't need to necessarily remember these philosophers, but I want you to realize that there is a history behind this argument, and that this argument has been discussed from the beginning, as far as we know, from the beginning of recorded human civilization. The argument was further developed by contemporary philosophers. Richard Swinburne from Oxford, Alexander Proust from Baylor, Robert Koons from University of Texas at Austin. And these philosophers have done quite a bit to develop this particular argument. And this argument is, as I said, the cosmological argument from cause and effect. Now let me just say something that I wanted to say earlier, but I'll say it now, which is that I want to just kind of remind you that there are different ways of investigating this question, many different tools that you can use. Some people have experiences, such as near-death experiences. We've talked about those. And they might have a belief in God based on those experiences. But the problem is that not everybody has those same experiences. So not everybody will have the same basis for belief. And I want to just almost like make a distinction here between public reasons and private reasons. You can think of public reasons as reasons that anybody across culture could investigate and access. Whereas a private reason is something that's based more just on your own experience that isn't publicly accessible. It's not universal to everybody. And it might be that the private reasons are even the most powerful reasons. It might be that. But if that's the case, then that's going to result in a lot of diversity of viewpoints, because everybody will have different experiences, different private reasons. And so there will be people who don't have those reasons who might say, there's no evidence for God, or you have no argument for God. You have got no reason for God. And part of that could be that they don't have your same experiences, or it could be that they have had your experiences, but they've had, in addition to your experiences, other experiences that allow them to analyze those experiences in a different way than you might analyze. So there can be a lot of diversity, is my point, and it's based on diversity of experience. But one thing that I want to do in this class, I want to give you tools to analyze public reasons. I want to give you tools to think about reasons that could be accessed or analyzed, investigated across culture, across time, from different perspectives. So like anybody from any perspective can investigate whether 2 + 2 = 4, for example, or whether something can just come from nothing, and they can investigate different potential evidence for thinking that effects have causes, or events are preceded by conditions that cause those events. So that's kind of just a big picture thing I wanted to say about how to investigate this question about God's existence. There are many ways. And I think it's important to realize that, because I think sometimes people will sort of limit themselves to one type of way and then diminish the other ways of investigating. They'll limit themselves to their personal experience, or they'll limit themselves to public reasons. And if there are no public universal reasons, they'll discount personal experience. And I think it's just helpful to realize there are just many tools, many different ways. And in this class, we're going to focus on one particular strategy or one particular way of investigating. And that is through public reasons. Reasons that are accessible to many different people. Okay, and I've already mentioned there are many different types of public reasons. There's arguments from consciousness, from design, from rationality, from reason. And here we're going to be focusing in some detail on this argument from cause and effect. So this is what I've sent you guys. You've got reading on this that you can look at to go deeper. And I'm going to just unpack this. So this argument has 2 parts. The first part seeks to show that there is some ultimate cause of everything else, some sort of first cause or foundational cause. And then the second part seeks to show that this ultimate cause has the divine nature, or is maximally great. So remember, I was defining God as a being that is the greatest that can be conceived, or it's a being than which none greater could be conceived. Okay, so it's at the limit of greatness, greatest being. Not just the greatest actual being, but the greatest being of all the possible beings. So that's how we're thinking of God. And one of the reasons, by the way, that I want to think of God this way is this is a high bar. So I'm not just arguing for the sort of higher power. Maybe there is a higher power, but I want to argue for the greatest being. I want to investigate arguments for that. And this sets the bar high for us. So, yeah, those are the 2 different parts of the argument, and I'm going to look at each part one at a time. And bear with me, because I'm going to take some time with this. I think people want to see the whole thing at once. That's what our minds, it's like a staircase. If an argument is a staircase, you want to see the whole staircase at once, but you can't really leap up a whole staircase all at once. You have to take one step at a time. And so we're going to slow down the argument. And today I'm going to only just focus on the first part. Why I think there's some ultimate cause of everything else. And then later we'll look at the second part that seeks to show that this ultimate cause would have a supreme nature. Are you guys curious? You guys curious how this argument's going to go? Have you seen this argument before? Okay, now again, my goal is to use publicly accessible reasons so anybody can test what I'm about to say and see if what I'm saying is true. So last time we talked about the puzzle of existence. So I'm going to be talking about that first stage, why I think there's this ultimate cause or ultimate foundation of things. And the puzzle of existence is actually a way to motivate this. So remember last time we talked about the puzzle. The puzzle had to do with this question, why does anything exist at all? Why not just nothing? Okay. And sorry, I don't want to get ahead here. And one way of unpacking this puzzle is to focus on this sort of bizarre contradiction. The bizarre contradiction is the contradiction between two things. The first thing is that everything seems to depend on something else. Everything is caused by something else. Your iPhone comes from something that produced it. Your pillows come from something. Everything comes from something else. But that's a contradiction, because reality in its totality, the whole thing, all of it, including God, if God exists, or if God doesn't exist, just including everything without God, all of it, nothing produced, nothing outside of everything exists. There's nothing outside of everything, because everything includes everything. So there's nothing outside, there's nothing beyond everything, and therefore there's nothing outside everything that produced everything. There's no outside cause or outside explanation of reality. But everything that we see has an outside cause and outside explanation, something beyond it that produced it. And so we have got a contradiction on our hands. And I hope that you've had some time to kind of just ponder that a little bit. Think about, okay, well, how do you solve that puzzle? Well, here's how you do it. You build an argument. I'm going to show you the whole argument. There's the picture at the bottom there. The argument is that reality actually divides, the picture shows that reality divides into two types, two sections. There are contingent effects. These are things that exist, but their non-existence is a real possibility. They can fail to exist. Okay? Those things depend on prior causes. Those things are part of our experience. We don't have any experience with a necessary thing, something that has no ability to not exist. We have no experience with a necessary thing having a prior cause. We've never, well, okay, I'll speak for myself, but I'm inviting you to consider this for yourself, because I'm proposing to you that this is universally accessible. Anybody can investigate this. So think of a necessary thing. It might be hard to even have an example in your mind, but imagine that there is some particle, and it cannot come into being, it can't go out of being, it can't fail to exist. It has necessary existence. Okay? Have you ever experienced a particle like that actually be caused to exist? You might think that's conceptually absurd, actually. How could it be caused to exist if it already exists of necessity? How is that even possible? Now, I'm going to leave open whether a necessary thing could be caused, because for this argument, all we're doing is we're focusing on contingent things. Contingent things aren't necessary. They exist, but they could fail to exist. So now let's look at the argument up here. Okay, we've got premise one here. So premise one says that every contingent portion of reality, so every bunch of things, one or many, so I say portion of reality, that will include one thing or many things. So chairs, iPhones, planets, all these things depend on prior causes. This is what experience supports. We've experienced contingent things come from prior causes. Okay? Now remember, the puzzle of existence was, how could everything be caused? Well, this premise focuses on the things we have experience with having causes. Contingent things. It's not that everything has a cause. The necessary foundation has no cause. If there's a necessary foundation, this is going to solve the puzzle of existence. It's going to account for how reality in its totality, all of it, has nothing outside of it that produced it. Instead, it's got something within it, namely a necessary foundation. So look at that second premise. If every contingent portion of reality depends on prior causes, then there is an ultimate cause of contingent reality. Therefore, there is an ultimate cause of contingent reality. This is just modus ponens, so this is A. If A, then B. Therefore, B. All right, so tucked into premise 2 is the assumption that there is something. Because if there were just nothing, then you wouldn't have this conclusion that there's an ultimate foundation. In fact, the existence of something was what gave rise to our puzzle. How could there be something if there's no outside cause of everything? And the answer here, by this argument, is that there's something special at the foundation of reality, something that is uncaused, something that's ultimate. So this is an argument for the ultimate cause here. Every contingent portion of reality depends on prior causes. If every contingent portion of reality depends on some prior cause or causes, then there's an ultimate cause. Here I'm using the term cause in a way that will include any kind of condition or conditions. So I'm leaving it open. What could be the cause? Okay, now that was it. That was the first part of the argument. Okay, so in the second part, we're going to unpack the nature of this ultimate foundation. But you might have questions at this point. You might have objections even. And so you can see ahead, we're going to be unpacking an argument for thinking that this thing is eternal and ultimately that it's supreme. But I don't want to get ahead here. I want to go back to this picture. And I want to invite you to think of potential objections to this argument. Potential objections to the argument. Remember, objections target premises. So is there a reason to think the first premise is not true? Or is there an objection to the first premise that undermines any reason to think that it is true? Or think of that second premise. Why I think that premise is true. Why I think it isn't true. And so we will begin to analyze some of the objections. I've got another video I'm going to send you where I give a discussion of 8 common objections to this type of argument. And I'm going to give you kind of another angle on the argument itself. I'm going to present it in a slightly different form so that you can see the basic reasoning behind the argument. My goal here isn't so much to get you to memorize an argument. I want you to understand the argument intuitively so that you can actually formulate your own version of this argument. This, by the way, this form of the argument, I said this was an argument from cause and effect. There are many arguments from cause and effect. And this particular argument from cause and effect is called the contingency argument because it's an argument from contingent things. So this is an argument that I've worked on quite a bit in my own career. I've got quite a few different articles on this argument. And so I can send you more resources and you can go into more and more depth if you'd like on this argument. But my goal here is just to give you an introduction to the argument so you understand it. One thing I'm going to say in closing is a little bit more about this first premise and what supports it or what could support it. Now I want to be modest here. Okay, see, I use this language of could support. My own view is that this premise is well supported, but of course my goal isn't to get you to believe me, but to get you just to think about it for yourself. So there was a time when I wasn't convinced by this premise. And this was after I even already was convinced that there was a necessary thing that caused everything else, and I was convinced of that by other arguments, but this particular argument, I wasn't quite convinced of it. And the reason was because I wasn't sure whether every contingent portion of reality depends on some prior cause. I wondered whether maybe there could be some contingent portions of reality that are different, that are uncaused. And I thought in particular maybe about the origin of the universe. I thought like if there's going to be something uncaused, that would be it. I thought probably the origin of the universe was caused, but how do I know? Maybe that's a very special event. So how do I really know? And but then I'll just have to tell you that over years, maybe 10 years or so, I kept coming back to this. I kept thinking about this. And there are certain arguments for premise 1. But I want to focus just on one consideration for you here. Richard Taylor, in the reading that I've sent you, he talks about an argument from kind of intuition or reason. And he uses this example of a sphere that you find in the forest. I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about is related, but it has to do with experience, not so much just reflecting on your intuitions, but just reflecting on your own experiences. And then asking this critical question, this all-important question, what things in your experience that are caused, or let me say this differently. Okay, let me be concrete about it. So let's say you've had an experience of things coming from other things. You've experienced your own thoughts having prior conditions and other thoughts. So you have this experience, and you might think that what best explains your experiences of one thing coming after another is a kind of causal order. You might leave open the nature of this causal order, but there's a kind of cause and effect sequence. You see things going on in the world. You don't just imagine, oh, there's nothing that produced it. Even this video, like imagine everything I'm saying is just coming to you unproduced, uncaused, just randomly, coming from nothing. The all-important question is, what difference could be relevant to demarcate things that are caused and contingent versus things that are uncaused and contingent? And the more that I've thought about it, the more that it looks to me that there's no relevant difference between contingent things. It's a little bit like the law of gravity, which applies to massive things. We make our observations of masses and we think, gravity applies to masses across the universe, even though there are places of the universe we haven't seen. But we extrapolate from what we have seen. Unless we have some independent reason to think that there's a special area of the universe where gravity doesn't apply, the default assumption is going to be that gravity probably applies there. In the same way, one can argue for this first premise. This doesn't have to be a proof, but it's a probabilistic support that this premise best explains. It's a simple explanation of all of our experiences with contingent things coming from other things. And the more that I've thought about this, the less skeptical I've become of this premise, the less unsure. To the point where, at this point, this premise seems to me to be very well supported. In fact, it seems to be at least as well supported as anything we know in science. Anything that's supported in science, because all of science reconfirms this same premise by reconfirming the causal order. So you may have questions, you may have objections, and that's great. And I encourage that. And so we want to investigate this. My whole mission here is just to help you to understand the argument and to help you to be really inspired to think about it for yourself and to analyze it. So let me know your questions, and I hope this video serves you. Thank you.